Kathryn, it's wonderful to have you on the program. I really appreciate you taking some time to talk with me today about all things ACNA, ACNA, Anglican Church in North America. But before we begin, I do want to make sure that our you and our listeners are aware of a disclosure. I am a member of an ACNA church. I have, in fact, I've been involved in three different church plants or church startups in the Charlotte area over the last 15 or 18 years. And my brother-in-law, my wife's brother, is a bishop in the Anglican Church in North America, TJ Johnston. So I felt like it was only fair to mention those involvements before we jumped into the conversation. So I know a little about ACNA, but Kathryn, you are my go-to person whenever it comes to journalism about ACNA. You've been writing about ACNA for Religion News Service for a number of years. You've been covering it all. Can we begin with just kind of an overview? What is ACNA and why is this really small denomination worth, some high-powered reporter like yourself's attention?
Thanks so much for the intro, Warren. So yes, the Anglican Church in North America, it's a really interesting denomination. It formed in around 2009 by a group of churches who left the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church in Canada. Now, these churches left over a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons included concerns about these other two denominations, sort of movement toward LGBTQ inclusion, their policies around women's ordination, and also changes to the Book of Common Prayer. So the Anglican Church in Canada, the Anglican Church in North America, it's rather small. My understanding is it hovers around 1,000 congregations. And you maybe know more about this as someone who's in ACNA on the ground, but my understanding is that it's also interesting sort of liturgically and culturally because yes, it came from these more high church denominations. So it does have that more formal liturgical flair, but it also has welcomed a lot of folks who maybe came from more evangelical backgrounds. And so you sort of see that fusion on the ground oftentimes. And there's also been a lot of growth in ACNA over the last several years as well.
Yeah, the churches that I'm involved with, in fact, I would say that certainly in the last 10 years or so, maybe even longer than that, we have very few former Episcopalians in our churches. We have a lot of refugees from evangelicalism, from the Protestant. My pastor, my rector, right now, for example, is a former pastor in the Presbyterian Church in America. The pastor of the previous church, the ACNA church that I went to, was a former pastor in the Lutheran church, the more conservative wing of the Lutheran church. So, yeah, you're quite right. There is a fusion, you might say, of different traditions, but all of them, at least the ones that I've been experiencing over the last few years, have been, fairly intentional about their Anglican identity. Though some I'm hearing are not. So that's a little bit of ACNA. The expression that I often use, Kathryn, for ACNA is that it punches above its weight. You're right. It only has about 1,000 congregations, about 125,000 members. Compare that to 13 million for the Southern Baptist Convention, 5 million or so for the sort of newly configured United Methodist Church. Even well over 500,000 for the PCA, which is another denomination that I would say punches above its weight. But it punches above its weight in part because a lot of leaders in the evangelical movement have migrated to Anglicanism in the last few years. So it does cause the denomination to have kind of an outsized impact. And people, for example, like J.I. Packer, before he passed away, who was very well known to evangelicals, was a part of ACNA as well. That said, all that good stuff about growth and et cetera, ACNA's got problems right now. And you've been covering some of those problems. Let's start with Bishop Stuart Ruck, who is the Bishop of the Upper Midwest. This is a controversy that has been going on for probably close to 5 years. It was recently resolved with Bishop Ruck being acquitted of charges against him. But can you back up and sort of take us to the beginning and rapidly come forward and tell us what was going on with Bishop Ruck?
Yes, I'll do my best to summarize. So, the controversy around Bishop Ruck really came to the surface in the summer of 2021. That is when the mother of a 9-year-old daughter came forward with allegations that her 9-year-old had been abused by a lay pastor in the Upper Midwest Diocese. So a lay minister, he's not ordained, this guy, but he did serve in a church within Ruck's diocese. Those initial allegations led to the discovery of several other allegations against this lay minister, and then led to the discovery of several other allegations against leaders in that diocese. So ultimately, this lay minister, his name was Mark Rivera, he was convicted of felony sexual assault and felony child sexual assault. Then, about more than 10 other clergy in this same diocese were also accused of misconduct. Now, where Ruck comes into all this is folks say that the buck stops at Ruck. He's the bishop of this diocese. And so they say he mishandled some of these allegations against these church leaders. Folks have also said that Ruck knowingly allowed folks with predatory histories of predatory behavior into churches in his diocese, that he knew that some of these men had histories of abuse or other kinds of misconduct, and he said, go ahead, you can be a leader in these congregations, and he did not alert those congregations to that fact. So that's sort of a summary of the allegations against Ruck. He is a very influential figure within the denomination. He's very charismatic. He is very beloved to many in his congregation. And so it was a really big deal when these allegations started to surface. What's interesting and important to know about the Anglican Church in North America is that because it's kind of a newer denomination, there haven't been that many bishops that have been tried in a church trial, right? I believe Ruck was only the second bishop to go to trial within the denomination. So it took a long time for that to actually happen, which made a lot of the abuse survivors agitated and upset, and they were looking for accountability very early on. They were making allegations that Ruck had mishandled allegations all the way back in 2021. Ruck did not come to trial until this past year, 2025. So that's sort of a summary of how we got to the trial. Would you like me to sort of go into what we saw happen at the trial?
Yeah, just very, very quickly, because there was so much craziness that we're probably not going to be able to unpack that in a way that's going to be satisfactory either to you as someone who knows what's going on and to our listeners. But I do think sort of you mentioned that the denomination is so new that that he's only the second bishop to have ever been tried, and I think a corollary to that fact, which I think is an important fact that you just mentioned, is that the process itself was really clunky. People kind of didn't know what to do and didn't have guidance, appropriate guidance from the canons because they were so underdeveloped. Is that a fair assessment, you think?
That is what I've heard. In fact, we know that the Anglican Church in North America is actively trying to revise their church bylaws to make it more clear what they're supposed to do at each juncture when allegations against a bishop arise. There were lots of disputes about who had the authority to do what. And the other thing about the ACNA canons is there aren't a lot of off ramps. So once there are allegations made against a bishop, there's not a lot of different ways to handle those allegations other than to take that bishop to trial. And so, yes, there were a lot of disputes about, okay, what do we do now? What do we do now? And it took a long time to actually get to the point where you could have the trial. So yes, the ACNA's church bylaws, sort of in reaction to the really detailed bylaws we see in the Episcopal Church, they're sort of loose. They allow for a lot of freedom and flexibility, and that was intentional. They wanted the denomination to be more nimble and more flexible and to not get bogged down as much as they perceived the Episcopal Church to sort of get bogged down. But unfortunately, that flexibility led to a lack of clarity. So that's why they're trying to revise those bylaws now.
Yeah. Ultimately, as I've already kind of stolen your thunder, Kathryn, Bishop Ruck was acquitted of those charges, but even that acquittal has generated at least some controversy, and I'm wondering if you would comment maybe on this, whether you think this is a valid critique or not. Bishop Ruck was originally brought on charges, as you mentioned, or the controversy came to light in 2021. So that was literally 5 years ago. And Archbishop Foley Beach was the Archbishop of ACNA at that time. So we now have a new Archbishop, Steve Wood, and we'll get to the Steve Wood controversy in a minute, because he's actually suspended because charges are pending against him right now.
Right.
But in some ways, this transition of leadership from Foley Beach to Steve Wood, Archbishop Ruck, I think, and this is where I want your reaction. He's very much a traditionalist within ACNA. He is not in favor of women's ordination. Foley Beach is in favor of women's ordination. Steve Wood has kind of hewed a middle ground on women's ordination. So I'm just wondering what you think about some of what I'm hearing, which is that some of the controversies related to Stuart Ruck and the trial and the delays and the changes in, prosecutors, if I could put it that way, in the trial, was in some ways a proxy war for some of the culture war issues that are going on within ACNA right now. Do you think there's any validity to that point of view?
It's hard to speculate. I think it's accurate to say that that is part of the context of this trial. I think it's important to put this trial within the context of those broader culture wars. I'm not sure whether we could say that that context informed the outcome of the trial, but I do think it's valuable to look and actually read the decision, hear why the decision was made. And also, I think it's really important here to pay attention to the voices of abuse survivors who are responding to that decision, as well as to the voices of the folks. They're called presentment authors. They're the folks who actually wrote the list of charges that were ultimately brought against Ruck. So what we know is that according to the court said there were mistakes made, but they chalk it up to being institutional failings rather than personal failings, right? So they sort of make this move of going, this is a church-wide problem, that the denomination itself made a lot of mistakes here. Ruck himself was not personally responsible. They also say that the evidence presented didn't sort of meet the clear and compelling evidence standard. Right. And they were also looking at not the sort of the questions they were asking were, does the evidence show that Ruck violated church bylaws? The church court said, from what they saw, the answer was no. But it's important to recognize, as the presentment authors have pointed out, that there were several survivors who were not invited to be part of the trial proceedings, and there were also survivors who could not be part of the trial proceedings. And so that's raised some questions about what was the evidence that was considered in making this decision. We also know that, like you said, there has been a big response to this decision. There has been a public letter circulating where over 70 ACNA clergy, 100 lay members, and 25 former ACNA members, they've signed onto this letter asking for an audit of the trial and everything that led to the trial. And we know that there's going to be some kind of audit of the proceedings expected this year. So that's important to know as well. So what we're seeing here, I think, is a tension between the court, which is trying to put the blame on the denomination and sort of this framing this as an institutional failing, and the perspective of abuse survivors and abuse survivor advocates who are concerned that abuse survivors were not centered in the process, that their testimonies were not taken seriously in this process. Does that help at all?
It does help, yeah. And so I think though my conclusion at this point is to be continued, right? So we'll see what happens with that case. And as much as I'm sort of a nerd and a geek about these issues, I do need to move on and talk about one or two other situations, Kathryn. And then the second situation I'd like to chat with you about is about Archbishop Steve Wood himself, because as I mentioned him a few moments ago. When the
Right.
Stuart Ruck trial began, he was the bishop of the Carolinas, which is where I am. He was my bishop for a number of years. And then he became the archbishop, which is the senior most bishop here in North America for ACNA. And then some credible accusations against him were raised. And well, let me just pause there. What were those accusations and what has happened as a consequence of those accusations?
Yes. So the Washington Post broke this story in October, and the allegations come first and foremost from a former children's ministry director. She worked with Bishop Wood in his capacity as, I believe, rector of his church, and she has alleged that Wood gave her over $3,000 in church funds, and also that he attempted to kiss her in a church office space prior to his becoming archbishop. There's also been a second woman who's come forward and has said that she was pressured into uncomfortable situations with Wood, and also that he invited her to drink alcohol with him in a way that made her feel uncomfortable. This second woman has been unnamed. And then there's also various allegations about plagiarism and about bullying. And again, these allegations, as far as we know, all refer to incidents that happened prior to Wood becoming archbishop. What's happened since these allegations came to light is that initially Wood sort of took a step back from his archbishop duties. Then there was outside pressure from members of the denomination saying him voluntarily taking a step back isn't quite good enough. We really want him to be inhibited in a formal way, or him to be temporarily suspended from his duties in a more formal way, so that he can't voluntarily sort of come back from his leave. And so that did happen. He was temporarily suspended from his archbishop duties. And now we know that he is going to face a church trial for the charges related to these allegations. We don't yet know when that trial is going to take place, but in the interim, another bishop, Bishop Julian Dobbs, he's dean of the province, and he's sort of taken on those archbishop duties.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that Julian is very much a traditionalist. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, Steve Wood was kind of hewing a middle road when it came to women's ordination in particular. Not so much, I mean, they're all traditionalists on LGBTQ issues pretty much, but when it ordination there's diversity. So again, there's a bit of a subtext here. Not only are the presenting issues Steve Wood's wrongdoing, Stuart Ruck's wrongdoing, or not wrong, or not, I should say, in both cases, alleged wrongdoing. But there's also kind of this subtext where people are aligning behind either Stuart Ruck or Julian Dobbs or Steve Wood or the process. Some people are not aligning behind individuals, but aligning behind the process or criticizing the process based in part on their positions on these other issues. At least, again, from where I sit, that seems to be the case. Any comment about that?
From where I sit, the folks that I try to center in my reporting, when I report on any issue, I try to center the voices of the folks who are most impacted by that specific issue. In the case of abuse and misconduct, I'm always trying to make sure I'm hearing the voices of the folks who have the allegations, take those really seriously, and then, of course, hear the broader context and hear from all the players in those complex situations. What I've seen is that folks in the sort of abuse survivor space, whether they're survivors or advocates for survivors, initially, when Wood was elected, there was a measure of optimism. There was a measure of, sort of cautious okay, maybe this will actually be a change. A lot of the abuse survivors were very disappointed with how fully Beach had handled abuse allegations, and they felt like he had not taken their allegations seriously. So there was hope that with Archbishop Wood, there would be a real shift. And in fact, he used the word transparency a lot when he came to this position. And he also hired a person to work full time implementing safeguarding guidelines, right? Tiffany Butler, I'm forgetting her official title, but he hired a person whose full-time job was to make sure that the dioceses were meeting sort of minimum requirements when it came to safeguarding. And so it seemed like, oh, maybe he is taking safeguarding misconduct really seriously. So I think when the Washington Post report came out, it was a real blow to a lot of the folk in the survivor community. So that's sort of the dynamic that I've been paying attention to from my corner.
Yeah, that makes sense. And let me just say for the record that I've really been grateful for your coverage, Kathryn. I thought it's been very fair and even-handed and factual, which of course is the sort of a very important first principle. Which because honestly, in a situation like this, you can, there's an old joke. You can have an old saying rather. You can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. But unfortunately, there are, as you know, some controversies, and this is, I think, maybe one of them, where people make up their own facts, and just getting the facts straight is not a trivial exercise. And you've, I think, done that really splendidly in your coverage over the last couple of years of ACNA. Okay, so now Stuart Ruck, check mark. Steve Wood, check. Let's now move to Derek Jones and the chaplains. And this is kind of even more recent and more current, but real quickly, what happened there and where are we? Because that situation, again, is a to be continued situation.
It is. Trying to figure out the best way to summarize this. So Bishop Derek Jones is in charge of a nonprofit that also used to serve as a jurisdiction within the Anglican Church in North America. This chaplaincy jurisdiction slash nonprofit was in charge of endorsing all the chaplains within the Anglican Church in North America. Within the last year, there were certain misconduct allegations against Derek Jones. Bishop Wood, when he is Archbishop, so during the time when he was, before the allegations against Archbishop Wood came to light, Archbishop Steve Wood moved to try to investigate the misconduct allegations against Bishop Derek Jones. However, before that investigation could get underway, Bishop Derek Jones said that he was going to exit the denomination and take his nonprofit with him, this sort of chaplaincy jurisdiction, the jurisdiction of armed forces and chaplaincy. The rationale given was they believed that the Archbishop Wood was sort of jumping ahead in the process and was initiating an investigation that was against church bylaws. Again, this is really in the weeds, but I think big picture here, this points at the sort of discrepancies that arise because of how loose the church bylaws are when it comes to guidance around investigating bishops and holding bishops accountable. Because it's so loose, there can arise these different discrepancies about who's allowed to do what and at what juncture. Okay, so big picture, Bishop Derek Jones and his nonprofit said, we no longer are going to be part of ACNA. We are going to exit the denomination. This sort of led to a crisis for the chaplains within ACNA who were like, oh no, who is going to be endorsing us? Did you want to jump in?
Let me just interrupt you if I could, Kathryn,
yes.
Because chaplains, ACNA's chaplains has in some ways been one of the success stories of ACNA. Because when Derek Jones, took over leadership, there were essentially no chaplains because the denomination was brand new. And, most recently, whenever they exited, there were about 300 ACNA endorsed chaplains within the military, and that's out of about 2,000. At least that's my recollection. About 2,000 total chaplains in the military. So ACNA suddenly went from 0 to 15% of the chaplains in the military in a very short period of time. So I think that's one of the things that sort of exacerbated the impact of this recent move, was because Derek Jones had been successful at organizational building. He was having an outsized impact in the military because now they had 15% of the chaplains. And again, there's this subtext of the culture war. Derek Jones is very much a traditionalist, very much a conservative, and was accusing Steve Wood and other of his critics of being woke, of being progressive, of being liberal. And so that became a subtext in this controversy as well. So anyway, sorry to interrupt the narrative, but I wanted to just get that in.
No, thank you. That's such important context here. And you're right. It's really interesting to pay attention to how these culture war tensions are also playing out in these various instances. So now, Derek Jones says that he's no longer a bishop within ACNA, but ACNA says, no, you can't officially leave. Our bylaws actually don't allow you to voluntarily leave. There's an official process for doing that. And so he is supposed to face a church trial himself for charges related to disobeying church bylaws and promoting schism. It's not clear whether Bishop Derek Jones has responded to the church's, claim that there's going to be an investigation. It's not clear if he's going to participate in that investigation. But if he doesn't, he'll be tried in I think it's in absentia. He'll be tried whether or not he's actively participating. Another piece of this is that there's a lawsuit ongoing. So this jurisdiction of chaplains, they have sued the Anglican Church in North America for trademark infringement because they say they continue to use the same jurisdiction of armed forces and chaplaincy language, and also for unfair business practices. So that lawsuit is ongoing. Like you said, this is another one of those issues that's to be continued.
Well, let me just say, for people that are thoroughly confused by all of these issues right now, that go to MinistryWatch.com. Kathryn is a reporter for Religion News Service, but we are subscribers at Ministry Watch to Religion News Service, and we publish a lot of our stories there. And you can do a deep dive if you want to really sort of go into these issues. But for now, let me just say, Kathryn, I think you did a great job of explaining what is an extraordinarily complex situation. In fact, 3 extraordinarily complex situations. So I want to land this airplane, if I could, by just asking, I know journalists don't like to predict the future. They like to report the past rather than predict the future. And I know you don't like to offer your opinions because that sort of boxes you in and sort of in some ways compromise your objectivity. But nonetheless, I'm going to ask you to violate both of those principles and say, and because you've already said a little about this, there's going to be an audit, for example, in the Stuart Rugg situation. The trial against Archbishop Wood is ongoing, and the lawsuit with Derek Jones is ongoing. So we know we can predict the future a little bit because we know these things have to play out. But in your opinion, based on what you're talking to, what's the future of ACNA relative to these situations? Are these growing pains? Are these situations that have revealed deficiencies in the bylaws and the canons and the processes that will get fixed and the denomination will go forward? Or are you hearing that there's a real possibility of schism as a result of these and other situations within ACNA? What are your thoughts about that?
You're right. I don't share my opinion, but I can absolutely share what I'm paying attention to. What I'm paying attention to here is what I am seeing as a real lack of trust. In religion writ large, there is a lot of distrust when it comes to institutions. For folks who are abuse survivors, folks who are advocates for abuse survivors, or even just folks who have concerns, who are concerned about the welfare of abuse survivors within ACNA, there is a lot of distrust right now. And I think the leadership is aware of that. We know that there is going to be a bishops' meeting just in a couple weeks, and they've said that a top priority for this bishops' meeting is going to be looking at the reforms to the church bylaws and at improving processes for vetting and electing bishops. So I think that ACNA knows that there is a trust issue here and recognizes that this is a big deal, and they're going to try to do their best to try to earn back that trust. In my experience as a reporter, it is really hard for institutions to earn back trust, especially when survivors have felt that that distrust has been betrayed time and time again. So what I'll be watching for is the ways in which ACNA leadership is working to build back trust. I'll be looking at the ways that they are going to work to reform those bylaws, if those reforms are going to be able to be passed and voted on, if they're going to be implemented, if having a more robust and a clearer process for holding church leaders accountable will make a difference. And I'll be watching definitely to see that audit of the bishopric proceedings, to see who is going to be hired to do that audit. Will that body be a body that folks trust to do that audit? Who's going to pay that body to do that audit? And what will be the timeline for that audit? So I'm very curious to see how that is going to play out and if it'll make a difference as we're seeing this distrust of institutions play out again in a big picture sense, but also very specifically here within ACNA.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good assessment of the possible near future. So thank you for that, Kathryn, and would love to have you back on the podcast in the future to, as things unfold. So thanks again for your time today. Grateful for your coverage. Appreciate you being on the program.
Thanks so much for having me.